History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Dark Side Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Today I'm joined by Ray McGovern, a former CIA intelligence officer from 1963 until 1990, who reached the heights of preparing the president's daily briefs. In more recent years, he became an activist against the overreach of government and intelligence agencies and formed the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity group. He's been critical of most American foreign policy for the past 50 years, having confrontations with the likes of Donald Rumsfeld and Hillary Clinton. But he's also formed friendships with WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Mr. McGovern, welcome to the Political Dark Side. How are you?
Thank you, Matthew. Doing well. I hope you are too.
Yes, I am. Thank you. Very much so. I want to get you on today because having recently discovered your work, it occurs to me that you've had a thoroughly fascinating life, and there's many, many things I want to ask you, but I'll try and boil it down into a chronological history of how we've ended up getting to where we are today, and hopefully you can shed some light on historical events that have brought us here, if that's all right with you.
Sure, that's fine.
Great. So you started with the CIA in 1963, which is a hell of a year to pick given the assassination of President Kennedy. What kind of intelligence were you looking at around this time, and how long was it until people started to suggest that the CIA were involved in that?
I was drawn to Washington in my senior year of college when John Kennedy said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. There was a whole vintage of people like me who were attracted by that and came down to Washington. Now, I graduated with a degree in Russian studies. The Army, which commissioned me on graduation, put off my call to active duty for 2 years until I could get my master's degree in Russian studies and I could teach a little bit. And then I was called to active duty just at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you can believe it. Went through infantry officer school and then intelligence officer school, served by 2 years. And it was a very, very easy transition to become an analyst, not an operator, but an analyst at the CIA, where my first portfolio was Sino-Soviet relations and the international communist movement, Soviet policy toward those things. So it was a fascinating start. It was a very active account. And watching what has happened over recent years with respect to relations between Russia and China has been astounding to me. I've learned a lot. And I've tried to import some of the lessons from the distant past in the 60s and 70s to people who really don't seem to have a clue about relations between Russia and China. Still think in terms of a triangle, a triangular relationship. At one point, we could take advantage of the hostility between Russia and China. No longer can we do so. Now it may be equilateral still, but it's 2 against 1. And Biden doesn't seem to be aware of that, given the fact that he talks about, that long multi-thousand-mile border with China. We must be worried about that. And my goodness, China is squeezing you guys. And so, wow, there's lots of opportunity there. And, to be squeezed like that, hello? I mean, don't his advisors know that whereas Kissinger and Nixon could exploit the race for good relations with the United States in the 70s, now it's just the opposite. The U.S. is the odd man out, and the loss of influence is not appreciated well in Washington. And I'm afraid that all this is going to come to what the Chinese used to call a no good end.
So you're saying, essentially, now compared to when you first got into the agency, the intelligence has got a lot worse, as it were.
Well, it has been politicized.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, of course, the death knell for intelligence. If intelligence is worth anything, it has to be objective. President Truman, who set up the CIA, famously said, I want people responsive to me, not to the Pentagon, not to the State Department. I want them to report to me with untreated intelligence. Untreated? Yeah. He would expect us not to say, as the Pentagon did, that the Soviets were 10 feet tall. He knew they weren't 10 feet tall. We said they were about 5'10" and maybe growing. The State Department would have its own policies to protect. And so he wanted someone who had no agenda under state or Pentagon that he go to and say, look, I want you to tell me untreated stuff, huh? I don't want your opinions. I want your analysis on the facts. And we were able to do that. I mean, that was heady work. That was a real high. And we were able to do that until Ronald Reagan came in and appointed Bill Casey to be his director of Central Intelligence. Casey found Bobby Gates, who would say anything that Casey wanted him to say. And that's when the politicization, that's when people started creating intelligence to justify the war of aggression against Iraq in 2003. Just to wind this thing up, when we saw what was happening, when we, people who were schooled in the objective assessment business, we saw that our former colleagues had been suborned by Dick Cheney and others into inventing intelligence on weapons of mass destruction, on a non-existent, well, on ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which did not exist. We formed Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. There were 5 of us to begin with. There are several times that now. And our first work was on the afternoon of Colin Powell's infamous speech at the UN, where he lied through his teeth. He claims he didn't know he was lying. That's really hard for me to believe. I know him. I used to brief him when I went in to see his boss, Cap Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense. So when we saw all this, we decided to write. We decided to warn, and we did warn President Bush. We had to assume that he had been taken in, that he wasn't in on this charade. So we did, and we wrote 3 memos before the attack on Iraq, none of which he paid any attention to. Just our conclusion in our first memo, dated 5 February 2003, the afternoon of Colin Powell's speech, we finished up by saying, Mr. President, we strongly suggest that you widen the circle of your advisors beyond those clearly intent on a war for which we see no compelling reason, and from which we believe the consequences are likely to be catastrophic, period, end quote. Now, they are catastrophic. We take no pleasure in having been right about that. We are really saddened that nobody listened to us, but we're on the record about that, okay? Months before it happened, and now we've written about 65 or 70 such Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity memoranda to the president. Since then, that's only about 3 a year, if I count them correctly.
Okay, I mean, so you've laid out your general worldview and how you've reached what event happened, e.g. the Iraq war around 9/11, and that's how you've reached the position that you take on government and intelligence agencies. But I'd just like to briefly pivot back to President Kennedy. I mean, how much does that change your work in particular on the day of his assassination and everything that, well, shortly followed thereafter?
Well, I was seconded, or actually employed by the agency while I was still a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Intelligence. So I came on the agency in April of 1963, joined a high-profile junior officer trainee program. We were going to be the leaders in the future, and went through training. And it was actually in the middle of the training that John Kennedy was assassinated. One could not appreciate the magnitude of what happened until later. Mm-hmm. We saw that his overtures toward the Soviets, reciprocated by Nikita Khrushchev, could have lit the path to a very peaceful future. I am convinced, based on people who have done serious hard work based on adequate sources, that it was a cabal of the deep state involving CIA, FBI, the supreme leadership of the armed forces that did him in. They thought he was soft on communism.
Yeah.
They had a personal animus toward him because he cashiered Allen Dulles and others, and you just don't do that in Washington. These are very important people. And I think the evidence is compelling that they got rid of him, and they pretty much liked what Johnson did in going into that Vietnam War full bore, even though Kennedy, in his last days, had issued 2 executive memoranda to pull out 1,000 U.S. troops within months, and then most of the remainder within 2 years. That was seen as giving Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and maybe the whole world, to the Russians, to the communists. Totally overblown. Not what we analysts thought, but what the operators and what the deep state, and I'm talking about the security state that still has pretty much, is still running the show here. And we can see that in many ways. And we can talk about that later if you like.
Yes, I mean, you mentioned Allen Dulles there. I mean, I did a previous episode that had elements of Operation Paperclip, and his name obviously pops up here and there. It seems as though he spends the early 20th century very much tinkering with the course of history. I mean, do you think he plays a part in the assassination?
Allen Dulles?
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, there's lots of evidence. Not only circumstantial evidence that he had this animus that he had been cashiered. Not only when he heard that John Kennedy said if he could, he'd smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, but he insinuated himself onto the Warren Commission. Now, the Warren Commission was appointed by LBJ to look into the JFK assassination thing. And who did they appoint to the commission but Allen Dulles, who became pretty much the chair of the commission, picking the witnesses and dissing other witnesses and doing all kinds of strange things, like visiting President Truman on a pretext and saying, you didn't really say that the CIA should stay out of operations, did you? And then he claimed Truman said, no, I didn't say that. Just if people are interested, Truman wrote an op-ed which appeared in the Washington Post 1 month exactly after John Kennedy was assassinated. What Truman said is, I didn't expect that the CIA would be involved in assassinations, covert action, this kind of stuff. That's not what I wanted. I wanted untreated intelligence. Now, we know from his papers in his library that he discussed this with his intelligence chief, Admiral Sowers, and that he felt that he really had to speak out And what better date than 1 month after John Kennedy was killed? Interesting thing is, and this speaks volumes, that appeared in the Washington Post on the 22nd of December, 1963, okay? But it didn't appear in the noon edition or the late edition. It didn't appear anywhere else except one little Independence, Missouri newspaper. In other words, it was unwelcome news. It was from the President of the United States, but when people saw the first edition of the Washington Post, they, oh my God, squash that, squash that. So they do that all the time right now, but that was the first time I saw the bizarre example where the first edition had it, no other editions had it, and no other media picked it up. Again, former President of the United States commenting on the assassination of John Kennedy.
Well, as the Washington Post likes to say now, democracy dies in darkness. So certainly doing its best to kill it off, isn't it? Anyway, the removal of Kennedy paves the way for the Vietnam War to go up a gear. I mean, we've subsequently seen information from the Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, that's shown that the prerequisite for the escalation, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, was essentially a false flag. I mean, throughout history, you've got incidents such as the USS Maine, the sinking of the Rainbow Warrior, the presentation of the Operation Northwoods plan for Cuba. I mean, how is it that agencies become comfortable with the idea of false flag operations?
Well, you know, it's more generally the case that it's a whole of government operation, okay? Now, the agency is usually the executive arm, but let's take the Gulf of Tonkin. Yes, we provoked the first attack. Was there an attack? Well, sort of. They try to follow U.S. destroyers, and they didn't even get near, but they did fire some shots. We recorded that. That was the 1st of August. We had all kinds of signals intelligence, which indicated what happened. On the 2nd of August, there was no attack. Okay. There were some sonic sounds, there were some bizarre things, mostly due to the weather, lightning storms and so forth, but there was no attack. Now, that didn't become clear until maybe late afternoon of the 2nd. And I knew I worked closely with the analysts for North Vietnam military. So I went down and I said, wow, Tom, you got your draft done for tomorrow morning? He said, yeah, I got my draft done, but the head of the office just came down and said that's going to go nowhere. I said, what'd you say in your draft? He said, it was a mistake, that if shots were fired, it was, they were not aimed at the ships. It was a non-event. And what did the boss say? The boss said, no, you can't publish that because LBJ wants to use this to justify a wider war. Now, that's down in the trenches, but that's where it is. Now, the next day, and we have this from McNeil Lehrer, we have an interview of McNamara, McGeorge Bundy, Rostow, those people who are most deeply involved in this. And so McNeil, I think, asks McGeorge Bundy, now, what happened that next morning? And McGeorge Bundy says, well, the president came in and I was sitting at my desk and he's a really big guy, he's just towering over me. And he says, well, okay, Mac, are you going to sell the Tonkin Gulf resolution to Congress? And I said, well, Mr. President, it's not quite clear what happened yesterday. We're still trying to, and he said, Mac, are you going to go up there and sell that or are you not? McNeil, so what'd you do? I went up there and sold it. Now, McGeorge Bundy had been a dean at Harvard, right? He comes from non-proletarian stock. He's not going to be out on the streets of Washington with his hat out asking for donations. He knows what ethics, he knows what right and wrong is. But it's like so many of these guys, especially, I would add, Ivy League types, they just do what power tells them to do. And so he thought, it's okay to say, well, I went up and sold it. My God. 58,000 US dead. How many Vietnamese dead? Between 2 and 3 million with an M, okay? And later, McNamara writes this book and he says, oh, we were wrong. We were terribly wrong. Well, McNamara, I won't say it.
Yeah, it's kind of like he just brushes it off like, oh, well, we were wrong, but there's no actual accounting for the dead bodies that have piled up because of that. It's
the generals who are involved, just like the generals today that assured us that if we gave 10,000 more troops to Afghanistan or maybe 30,000 more, would be seeing light at the end of the tunnel and everything would be all right. They can't be, well, maybe they can be that stupid. Maybe they can. I have to allow for that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think they're stupid. They're careerists. They know they can get an extra star if they get a command in Afghanistan. So just one vignette, I think, will point this up. Back in the day, okay, we're talking 1967, my colleague who entered the agency in the junior officer trainee program the same day I did, Sam Adams, he was put on the task of counting up how many armed Vietnamese communists were in the South. Now, Sam was a really bright guy. He was out of Harvard College, but don't mistake, that doesn't mean anything. He just was very bright, but he also had ethics and a moral sense. He, in other words, was devoted to the slogan on the CIA building that says, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall keep you or set you free. So Sam went and gathered all the prisoners of war reports and the defector reports and the signals intelligence and the clandestine reports and the overhead imagery, put them all together and found out that there were between 500,000 and 600,000 Vietnamese communists under arms in the South, okay? And everybody said, oh, no, Sam, you're wrong. No, you can't. It can't be. Why it can't be? He says, because General Westmoreland says there are only 299,000 Vietnamese under arms. Well, I won't go through the whole thing. Sam had support in Washington from every intelligence agency except the Army because of Westmoreland. In August of 1967, there was a cable that came in from Westmoreland's Deputy General Creighton Abrams. Now, Abrams was an expert tanker during World War II, but he forgot to retire when he should have. And he had no political sense because what he wrote in this cable, and I recite it verbatim, was, we can't go ahead with the numbers, the increased numbers that Sam Adams has given us. And we can't do that because we have been projecting an image of success in this war. And despite all the caveats we might adduce to explain the doubling of the figures on the enemy, the press in Saigon will draw an erroneous and gloomy conclusion, period, end quote. Now, that's what was going on, okay? Sam knew that because he visited Saigon and talked to some of Westmoreland's folks and Abrams' folks. Now, I mention that because here Sam had that, I think it was dated, it was in the middle of August, 1967. And I was tempted to say, Sam, see if you can get me a copy of that. Not easy to do. These were kept in the director's office, these really sensitive things. me a copy of that. I got to take that down to the Washington Post, the New York Times bureau in Washington. They don't misunderstand that it's not the New York Times of today. If I gave them that cable, they wouldn't call the CIA right away and say, "Oh my God, we got this cable. Sure, what should we do with it? Should we print it?" Or no, in those days, the New York Times was more inclined to print documentary evidence, like Daniel Ellsberg gave them years later. So I regret to this day that I didn't actually try to wangle a copy of that cable and go down. Now, that was 1967. It was August. Okay, in January, February of 1968 came the Tet Offensive, where every city, hamlet, village, and town in South Vietnam, virtually everyone was attacked by the VC. And it wasn't by 299,000 VC underarms. It was by at least 600,000 VC underarms. Lots of loss of death, also on the US side. So Sam's figures were proven correct in a most bloody way. And Sam couldn't resist sending out a cable to Saigon saying, "My God, how could they do this with only 299,000 communists under arms?" He never got an answer, of course. But these are the kinds of people that thrive. And I remember Westmoreland's funeral at the National Cathedral, a guy who had been totally discredited, a racist from South Carolina, who in an interview after he was retired, he said, the Oriental doesn't put the same value on life. In the Orient, life is cheap. So we can't really compare what we think about life and what the Oriental thinks. He said that. It's in an interview. I have it on tape. Now, that speaks volumes because there is a racist aspect to our foreign policy. James Baldwin talked about it. And if people look like us, they're far less likely to be waged war against. And China now coming into the fore is part example of that kind of racist attitude where, we white people, we have the white man's burden, and, what we used to call the naked feet running through the jungles of Vietnam, they certainly can't contend with us. And this is not only immoral, it's totally stupid.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the likes of that general would use it to justify almost the massive loss of life on the other side. If it dehumanizes them before they do it, of course.
Right. That's what they do.
Yeah, I mean, you touched briefly on the press actually having a sense of responsibility, and I suppose something that strikes me is that Watergate, it would have been, well, obviously was a massive story at the time and cost Nixon the presidency, but I get the impression that if something like that happened today, it would just be lost in the ether and barely register. It would just be a news cycle for 24 hours and then disappear again.
Well, Matthew, you say if. It is happening today. It has happened.
Do you mean with the DNC hacking? Or?
Well, I mean, the role that the FBI in particular and the CIA and the NSA and all these deep state agencies play in running our foreign affairs. And by snooping on all of us to make sure that if there's anything on us they can either detect or fabricate, we end up in jail. So yeah, it is happening. It has happened. And you mentioned Russiagate. The whole thing was built on the charge in late 2016, during the election, that the Russians had hacked into the Democratic National Committee, stolen those very damaging emails that showed that Hillary Clinton had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders, okay? Given them to the Russians. Or the Russians had stolen them. The Russians had hacked and given them to WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks published them right before the Democratic National Convention, and the rest of the stuff all came out before the election, and poor Hillary, she lost because the Russians hacked. You know, how do I say this? It's a male bovine excrement, okay?
You can swear on here; it's quite all right.
I've been trying to do
restrain yourself.
But you know, we saw from a technical aspect, and we in Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, we have two former technical directors from NSA. They looked at the evidence, and in December 12th, to be exact, 2016, we wrote a memo which said, impossible. Nobody hacked into the DNC, not the Russians, not anybody else. How do we know? Because we know how the system is set up. We know what Snowden exposed just, in 2013. We have a lot of expertise from being on the scene, right? And, we know about the laws of physics, right? We know how the speed with which a hack has to take place and how a download can go at a different speed. So this is, what is it called? Fluid dynamics, I think, okay? So we know all those things, and we can tell you, Mr. President, that no one hacked. It had to be somebody inside with access to the DNC computers, put a thumb drive in there, downloaded it, put it in his pocket, took a plane over to wherever Julian Assange published these things. That was December 12th, 2016. No, says Obama and Biden. No, the Russians did it. We got to throw out Russian diplomats. We got to confiscate some of their territories. So this is where it all began. Yeah. Now, I could say a lot more, but I'll just tie this up by saying that finally we learned that we were right. In other words, we were basing it all on what wasn't there, and it's hard to prove a negative. On the 5th of December, 2017, okay, long before Mueller had completed his investigation, the head of the cyber firm that the FBI asked to look into the DNC hack, in quotes, testified under oath to the House Intelligence Committee, again, December 5, 2017, and he said, we looked at all the evidence. There was no technical evidence of any exfiltration, fancy word for hacking, either by the Russians or by anybody else. Whoa! So they knew that. They knew that in December of 2017, okay? Yeah. Now, Adam Schiff, the head of that committee, kept that secret. For how long? Well, it wasn't published until May 7th, 2020. You can do the math, okay?
Yeah, I saw a video of you confronting Adam Schiff. It was quite amusing.
Let me just finish this. Why was it that the House Intelligence Committee under Schiff was forced to publish this testimony again, December 5, 2017, because the head of national intelligence, a new person brought in by Trump, told him to. He said, if you don't publish it, I will. So Schiff published it on May 7th, 2020. Now, if my subtraction or arithmetic is right, that's a year and a month plus ago. Has it appeared in the New York Times? Has it appeared in any mainstream media? No. So this gives the lie to the whole initiation of Russiagate, and the mainstream media have been able to suppress it until this very day. Have we published on it? Of course we have. Have we been ostracized from polite company, so to speak, in the mainstream media? Of course we have been. So all my friends up there in New York, where I went to university, they can't believe what I'm saying. Why? Because it wasn't in the New York Times. Okay. One little anecdote here. There was a woman who really felt passionately. She loved Rachel Maddow, and she loved all these things about Russiagate. And when she was told that she had been propagandized, she said, "Look, I haven't been propagandized. If I were propagandized, I'd be able to read about it in the New York Times."
That's not how it works. Yeah, that's incredible. I was going to pivot back to Hillary Clinton and Russiagate in a little bit, but I just wanted to ask, would it be fair to say you reached the most influential point of your career during the Ronald Reagan presidency? And how switched on was President Reagan? I mean, I get the impression that Vice President Bush was probably the one pulling the strings during that time.
I'm sorry, Vice President Bush was what?
Pulling the strings.
Not really. There were lots of strings.
Yeah.
Now, what's really interesting is that, Ronald Reagan was anti-Soviet to begin with. Nobody was going to call him soft on Russia. And Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, and a whole series of national security advisors, half of whom ended up in jail, and William Casey, the head of the CIA, all told Reagan, "Look, this Gorbachev guy, this Mikhail Gorbachev, he's a commie. He's just a cleverer commie. Don't be deceived." Okay.
Yeah.
Now, who was the sound of reason? George Shultz, the Secretary of State, and to a degree, Vice President Bush, Vice President George H.W. Bush, okay? Now, I used to brief them every other morning. We had a team every other morning. So I'd brief them 3 mornings a week. And I watched a battle royale go on, not so much at the briefings. I don't talk about the briefings. I could see it in the news. Schultz was building a record of credibility with Ronald Reagan. Weinberger and Casey were showing themselves to be troglodytes, to be stuck in a time warp where everyone's a dirty communist. Gorbachev was transforming the Soviet Union. And finally, George Bush was able to persuade Reagan, look, you can talk to these people. They mean what they say. There's real possibilities for arms control negotiations. And after a terrible start in 1983, where we almost came to the end of the world, I can talk about that later if you like, Reagan came around, and starting 84, 85, 86, we know that there were arms control negotiations, some agreements. And then in 87, a whole class of medium-range ballistic missiles were destroyed. They were already deployed in Western Europe, Pershing IIs, and the SS-20 Soviet counterpart. That was the most amazing agreement I ever thought of. They destroyed all those weapons, and now, of course, now that Trump and his people got out of that treaty as well. So, all I'm saying here is that if you're persistent, if you build trust, and George Shultz, Secretary of State at the time, died at the age of 100 years just a couple of months ago. Last thing he wrote was about trust. He was talking about building trust with the Russians, but he also had to build trust with Ronald Reagan. He did it in a gradual, just a very artful way. And Reagan came around and said, okay, trust but verify, just like Nixon did before him. We were the verification end of that. And I was never prouder of the role that the CIA was able to play in saying, yes, President Nixon, Yes, President Reagan, if you trust the Russians on this treaty, if they cheat, we can call your attention to that almost right away. Did they cheat? Yeah, they cheated big time. 72, the anti-ballistic missile treaty allowed just 2 ABM sites in each country. That way, neither country could think that they could escape in a retaliatory strike if they tried a first strike, okay? So just 2. Then it was limited to 1. Well, that was 1972. 1983, satellite photography uncovered a monstrous ABM radar in a place called Krasnoyarsk in the middle of Siberia. It could only be an ABM radar, illegal, a violation of the treaty. So what happens? We took the pictures, we showed them to Ronald Reagan. He called the Russians and said, look, it's a violation of the treaty. You want to see the pictures? Here are the pictures, okay? Now, in those days, there was a sense of diplomacy, of doing these things in a measured way. George Shultz, of course, was in control. It took 6 years, okay? It took 6 years, but in 1989, with George H.W. Bush as president, finally the Russians said, all right, okay, pictures don't lie. We're going to destroy it. And they did destroy it, okay? What am I saying? All I'm saying is this, that when we say we can verify these agreements, we mean it. In that case, we showed that we could do that. And so for this business today, where Biden is saying, we don't trust the Russians. This is not about trust. We're not going to trust them until, well, we'll wait 3 and 6 months to see if they behave themselves. See if, then maybe we'll start to trust them. Now, well, the whole thing has to do with a modicum of trust backed up by verification. Doverai a proverai. Trust, but verify.
So with the fall of the Berlin Wall, is that why your retirement from the CIA comes about? Is it a case of, well, job done? Or
yeah, you got it, Matthew. I clap myself on the back and say, wait, good job, Ray. The Soviet Union is falling apart. And Germany is going to be okay, too. It was partly that. It was actually mostly that I had been working down in the inner city of Washington, where poverty levels were then and still are very high. I wanted to work in the inner city and do more of this work. I wanted to do it full time. The Berlin Wall had fallen. There was a reasonable expectation because President George H.W. Bush said so, that the United States did not intend to, as he put it, to dance on the Berlin Wall. In other words, to take advantage of Russian problems in Eastern Europe. So I said, well, you know, there's not going to be the call for expertise on the Soviet Union or Russia anymore. So that was part of it. And the other thing was the intelligence was being politicized. Even then, Casey had just died. Yeah, he was dead, but Bobby Gates, who saluted anytime politicization was needed, and who kept telling Reagan and Bush, no, these Russians, Gorbachev is just a clever commie. He was still in place. I saw some of my friends bending under this politicization at the time. It was very sad, okay? So those 3 factors, plus the fact that since I had served overseas the requisite number of years, I qualified for early retirement at age 50. I took a big hit on my annuity, but I never regretted it. So I retired it as soon as I became 50 years old, which was early January 1990.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard you say that the policies that were enacted after 9/11 were the realization of certain individuals spending several decades doing political maneuverings. So with that in mind, I mean, do you just subscribe to any of the alternate narratives surrounding 9/11? I mean, I remember 15 years ago, I read David Ray Griffin's book, which suggested that at the very least, the intelligence was there and the event was allowed to happen and or spun in a similar way that we spoke about the Gulf of Tonkin incident, to create what the neocons described as a new Pearl Harbor in their project for the New American Century document. So yeah, how do you feel about the intelligence surrounding 9/11?
Well, my hat's off to David Ray Griffin, who did his level best in trying to bring all these things to our attention. 9/11 is terribly complicated. I know things that I wish I didn't know. I know, for example, that NSA had the whole Al-Qaeda network mapped out and monitored before 9/11. I know that they had information at NSA that showed, in particular, what was going to happen. I know that the director of NSA, a fellow named Michael Hayden, was told about that. What I'm not sure of is whether Michael Hayden told Dick Cheney, who was running the government at the time, or whether he did not. In any case, he would have known that Dick Cheney would have told him to shut up, put those analysts on a different account. We don't want to hear about this. That's damning. You know, that means that NSA had the evidence that would have been necessary. Did CIA have the evidence? Well, we know about these two Al-Qaeda operatives that were allowed to land in Los Angeles and were given succor, were given support by the Saudi embassy. We know that they had been identified as plotters because of a meeting back out there in Southeast Asia. And we know that the CIA never told Richard Clarke, who was the guru for anti-terrorism in the White House, about Mindar and Hamzi. Those were their two names, okay? Now, when Richard Clarke was asked, oh my God, you're the guy that's supposed to get this information and tell the president about it. What happened? He said, well, you know, I don't know why George Tenet, the head of the CIA at the time, didn't tell me about this. I mean, this is pretty damning. These guys, we knew what they were up to, but he never told me until 1 week before 9/11. And the speculation, of course, is that the CIA had no sources in Al-Qaeda. Granted, it's a hard target, but so that's their job, right? So here come two live bodies, two live Al-Qaeda operatives, okay? Now, should they tell the FBI? You tell the FBI, you lose control of these guys. You can't double them. You can't turn them. You can't use them. Better not to tell the FBI. Better not tell anybody. Let's see if we can turn them, and then we can brag about, wow, we got two Al-Qaeda guys working for us, right? That's how I reconstruct what happened. In any case, they would have, if they were wrapped up, we could have easily found out what they were up to. The third thing that I'll mention is that the FBI, to its credit, had a crackerjack unit in Minneapolis, and they found this fellow, what's his name? I'll remember in a second. He was learning how to fly planes, but he didn't much care about taking off or landing. Okay. And they were very alert. They were plugged into this aviation school. And they said, well, this is very bizarre. And the guy said, yeah, they're paying cash, big money too. So they wrapped him up on a immigration charge, okay? Moussaoui was his name, Moussaoui, okay? And then the FBI pleaded with headquarters, look, this guy's up to no good. We have to get into his laptop. We have to, and had CIA and FBI headquarters. No, you're not going to do that. And then finally, the head of the Minneapolis office of the FBI pleaded with headquarters, said, look, we don't want planes flying into the World Trade Center. I kid you not. This is a couple of weeks before planes plowed into the World Trade Center. FBI said, no, we're not going to do that. There were all kinds of issues that they raised, FISA issues and other things. So Moussaoui never was investigated. His laptop was never used. And, a little sidelight on this is that the agents that watched all this happen tore out their hair when asked years later if WikiLeaks existed at that period of time, and you were so frustrated, so sure what was going to happen, would you have gone to WikiLeaks and told them about this? And they said, of course we would have. Of course we would have. That's, of course, why the deep state hates WikiLeaks so much. Now, the bottom line here is that had they didn't have to even go into Moussaui's laptop. They could have just announced, oh, we've caught an Al-Qaeda operative in Minnesota, and the whole thing probably would have fallen apart because they would have had to assume that Moussaoui would spill the beans. So none of that happened. NSA, CIA, FBI. So there's a complex series of things that should have happened and didn't. Now, my friends, I'm from New York. I spent my first 22 years there, okay? I have a cousin who perished on the top of the World Trade Center, okay? So I feel a little personally involved here. What I really what I really hate is people who are trying to get to the bottom of this thing and are dismissed as conspiracy theorists. That's a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy theorist. It's somebody trying to find out what the hell happened, okay? And so I applaud the people looking into all these unanswered questions. I have actually helped the architects and engineers by chairing some of their very early sessions in Berkeley and in Boston. I applaud their work. As for me, how do I come down on this? I come down on it by saying, look, there are a lot of indications that we should have been able to prevent this thing. We did not prevent it. I have not had time to look into these things as deeply as my friend David Ray Griffin and others, but I respect them very much. And I think that the real hateful thing here is people who dismiss others as conspiracy theorists. Now, last thing I'll say is that the 9/11 Commission, okay, 9/11 Commission issued this flowery report. It got literary reviews, so well written and all that stuff, right?
Yeah,
okay.
I've read it. It's rubbish.
It too. Now, 1 year later, the chairman of this commission wrote a book, and they said we were destined to fail. We weren't given enough money, weren't given enough time, we weren't given enough access to classified information, so we were doomed to fail. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks a lot, Give me a break.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage everyone listening to look up the architects and engineers group. I think is it Richard Gage that runs?
Right.
Yeah, he's doing a lot of good work on that. I mean, the whole idea of being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, it seems to be getting planted over X, Y, and Z situations. You're certainly seeing that at the minute surrounding COVID, but I don't really want to go into that at the minute because that's a hell of a can of worms. But
let me say a quick word about its origins, okay? And I'm pretty sure this. When John Kennedy was assassinated, and as we said before, Alan Dulles was appointed to the Warren Commission to pretty much direct how it came out, people would say, wait a second, there's some suggestion, at least there's some circumstantial evidence that Allen Dulles might have been involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. For God's sake, is this the right way to do this? And what did Allen Dulles say? Conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy theory. That's when it was given real steroids, okay? Yeah. And ever since then, the government has been able to use this, whether it's 9/11, whether it's Russiagate, or any of these things. Conspiracy theorists, no good. And in 9/11 case, of course, they're just trying to find out what really happened. And my hat's off to them, and I hope they succeed. Lots of stuff is dribbling out now. The only thing that gives me some pause is that with such a mammoth undertaking, usually with hundreds of people involved, somebody, before they go to their eternal reward or punishment, confesses and says, oh, you went over, it really happened. I was involved. This is what I did. This is what I know. Now, that hasn't happened.
It's early days yet.
What's that?
It's early days. We're only 20 years out, so.
Well, yeah, but people are dying, right? So
yeah.
I'm thinking that's not much, but it's a counterindication. You would expect something like that in these circumstances, and it's absent.
Yeah. I mean, so you developed the idea of, let me make sure I get this right, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex, which was building on President Eisenhower's warning about the military industrial complex. With the media in there, is this to suggest that Operation Mockingbird is real?
Oh, Mockingbird? Oh, sure. Yeah, and it still exists to a fairly well. This is the implantation of people in the media, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this goes way back, and it was thriving in those days. That's why Allen Dulles was able to get away with what he got away with on the Warren Commission. And today, well, as I suggested before, if the New York Times has something that they're a little afraid to go ahead with, they'll check with the White House or the CIA, and they'll, guide themselves accordingly. It's really obnoxious what's happened. There are all kinds of indications of that. One that sticks out in my craw is that George Bush wanted to be reelected. He was running for reelection in the summer of 2004. During that time, a New York Times reporter, James Risen, uncovered the fact that George Bush and Dick Cheney had authorized gross violations of the Fourth Amendment with people snooping on all manner of our communications. He had the story. We know what his source was. It was a golden story, okay? So about July, August, he says to his betters at the New York Times, my God, look at this story I have. I'm going to write it up and get it right out there so people can know what their government has been doing. And the gurus in the New York Times, no, not so fast. Not so fast, James. Let's check with the White House. The White House. You mean with George W. Bush? Yeah, we got to check this out. So they go down to the inner sanctum, the Oval Office, where Bush meets him. No, you can't. We're catching terrorists by doing this now. Don't. And so they say to James Risen, not now. It's too close to the election. July, August, September, October, too close to the election? Now, James Risen could have been a whistleblower at that point. But he thought, well, and I'm putting this in his own head, I could write a book about this, for God's sake. It'd be a big seller. So I'll write a book, and then we'll see what happens. They wait until December of the following year. We're talking December 2005. And Risen says to his betters at the New York Times, oh, I meant to tell you, I've written this book, and it has a chapter in here about the illegal eavesdropping on all us Americans. And actually, it's in Galley. This, just so you know, it's going to be a little embarrassing. You're paying me big bucks, actually, in this case, to keep my mouth shut. In other cases, to do some reporting. But it's going to look a little odd if my book appears and you haven't said anything in your newspaper. So down to the Oval Office again. Sulzberger, the Washington office chief bureau, comes. They all come down, Sulzberger being a big deal, of course. And George W. Bush said, no, you can't do this. Here's X reasons why you can't do this. And Sulzberger says, well, Mr. President, the book's in Galley. We waited a year and 3 months, and it's just too embarrassing. We're going to have to do it. And Bush says, well, I'm against it. Don't do it. So they do it. In the middle of December, there's a report by Risen and Lichtblau in the New York Times telling this story that James Risen wanted to tell in July of 2004. Bush got reelected. I think that's a real question as to whether he would have been reelected had the American people been exposed to this gross interference, this gross violation of our rights under the Fourth Amendment. That's just one example that kind of sticks in my craw. I could enumerate about 10 others.
Yeah, I suppose the most recent example is probably various revelations surrounding Hunter Biden that got blocked in the papers just prior to the 2020 election. But I was going to ask you about that in a little bit. But just to close off on the Bush administration there, your old friend, the great philosopher Donald Rumsfeld, in 2002, he says the following. I'm going to read this out. He says, reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me because, as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know. I mean, as mad of a thing as it is to say, he actually touches on something quite curious to me, and that's the general public's relationship with reality, truth, facts, whatever you want to call it. So my question is, how aware is the public of what the intelligence agencies actually get up to? In as much as we know there are things that we can't be told, the known unknowns. So what about the unknown unknowns to us? Like, how much, if you had to put a percentage on the general public's awareness of what's actually happening behind the scenes, how much do you think we know?
Well, if I may, I'm going to turn that question around before I answer it directly.
Okay.
The great philosopher Donald Rumsfeld learned that at Princeton. So those of you in awe of Ivy League universities, please bow gracefully. What he was saying was that we can't be sure of anything really, but we know that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And we know there are ties between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. We know that. Now, what's my point here? The fellow that Donald Rumsfeld appointed to be the head of satellite imagery reconnaissance, his name was James Clapper. He headed up the agency that not only programs the satellites, but by an accident of history, interprets the imagery. What's my point? James Clapper later became head of the entire national intelligence setup. And in his hubris, he wrote a book about his experiences in intelligence. And in the book, he talked about, whoa, we found things, namely weapons of mass destruction, that weren't really there. He says, you know, the pressure was so great from Rumsfeld and from Cheney that we bent over backwards to find evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And I take a certain amount of responsibility. It wasn't just the analysts, it was I as well who found things that weren't really there. That's a quote, okay? So, in the grander scheme of things, that was pretty much known that there were no weapons of mass destruction there. 100%? 99%, because we had the reports from Saddam Hussein's sons-in-law who testified to the UN and to every other people that everything had been destroyed, everything meaningful, okay? So that's the real tragic thing here, where Clapper is admitting that he manufactured evidence. Well, in his words, we found things that weren't really there. Fast forward to the Obama-Biden years, Clapper found things that weren't really there. Russian hacking. He was told to find Russian hacking, and so he did. What a perfect guy to have in that position, okay? Now, the thing you were getting at had to do with clandestine collection and those kinds of things, I think, Matthew.
It's more of a broad everything that the intelligence agencies, how much of our history that we don't actually realize is truth is more what I'm getting at, because if we're subject to the Mockingbird media, how can we ever really know what's going on, is my point.
Well, my son who runs my website would say at this point, you have to read raymcgovern.com. And you have to add that, he always says, if you don't get it, you don't get it. And if you want to, you can add that I spent 2 weeks making it really easily searchable. So tell him that, Dad. And if you don't tell him that, man, I'm going to be very disappointed. All right? No, that sounds strange. But it's not only raymcgovern.com. Glenn Greenwald is excellent. Matt Taibbi is also very good. The Gray Zone is wonderful. You know, there are really good sites out there before we get shut down where people can learn the real story. Problem is that educated people, and I talk about all my friends up in New York, highly educated people are so used to reading all the news that's fit to print in the New York Times that they trust the New York Times still. They trust the Washington Post still. The head of the op-ed, the head of the editorial part of the Washington Post, Fred Hyatt, he was the one that was beating the drums for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, ties with Al-Qaeda. And when asked 2 years later at a Columbia Journalism Review, Mr. Hyatt, how do you explain? You kept saying this WMD, and there you kept saying, and you know, as flat fact. How do you explain that? And he said, and this is a quote: "Yes, we were saying that weapons of mass destruction were in Iraq as flat fact, and if that wasn't the case, we probably shouldn't have said it. Period." End quote. My guru, Bob Perry, since deceased, commented, he says, "Yes, Fred Hyatt, if something isn't so, you're really not supposed to say it is. That's sort of like a cardinal principle in journalism." That guy is still head of the op-ed part of the Washington Post, almost 20 years later.
Yeah, we very much got the same problem in the UK with the BBC, and some of our newspapers are very picky in what they choose to print and project onto us. Anyway, moving on to, I was going to ask you about Julian Assange. I mean, I see that you're still growing your beard there, in solidarity with Julian. How is he, and what's the latest on his situation?
There's not much good news. Months ago, his father told a radio interviewer that he had been able to get in touch with Julian by phone, and that Julian was hanging in there. You know, that his endurance was quite amazing. More recently, we know that they're just trying to keep Julian going from place to place, from court to court, even though it was decided that he could not be extradited to the United States. What happened? Well, they put him right back into this maximum security prison, Belmarsh in London. Why? Well, because he jumped bail way back a couple of years ago. Yeah, but didn't he serve his sentence for jumping bail? Yeah, he did. So why put him? Well, look, that's what we do to people like Julian Assange. You don't get it? I mean, this is an example. You expose U.S. or U.K. war crimes, this is what you get, all right? I mean, hello, don't you understand? And we'll get you anywhere. If you live in Greenland, for God's sake, or the Antarctic, we'll get you because we're the United States, and we don't give a rat's patootie about the First Amendment, particularly when it pertains to people abroad. Journalists, doesn't matter if they're journalists. Journalists, that doesn't cover you. That doesn't protect you. We'll invent some other espionage charge against you. So look, this is what happens to you. Now, the High Court was supposed to decide whether to take the appeal that the U.S. did. In other words, the extradition was refused. The U.S. appealed. Julian's put back in prison. Now, that was way back early this year, if memory serves, like January or so. So we thought, well, the High Court has to decide whether to take the case by June. Well, it's the end of June right now. Now people are saying, well, maybe the fall. This is all very deliberate. And it was revealed in some of these Stratfor cables, which said we're going to keep Julian moving from place to place, never free, and we'll just make him an object lesson of what happens to anyone who dares to expose war crimes by the United States.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously tying him up in the legal process just to grind him down, as it were. I mean, I think you saw something, well, not necessarily similar, but I would say there's certainly going to be questions around the death of John McAfee the other day. That strikes everyone as quite unusual, I would say. Do you have any thoughts on what's happened there?
Well, yeah. Now, if he was bound to, if he was going to the U.S. for trial, and he had the means to commit suicide, I don't know the circumstances, but in a just kind of a general way, to avoid being closed up in a little room for the rest of his life, it would not surprise me that someone like McAfee would take his own life.
I've heard that as the general consensus, but equally there's also the idea that you might almost suspect he'd relish being, or he would have relished being the center of a trial almost, given the way he generally pushed back against the government in his life. It's hard to say. Anyway, I don't really want to dwell on that. I mean, just to go back to Julian Assange briefly, I mean, I'd like to read out a tweet that he wrote in 2017, I think. Here we go. There's something wrong with Hillary Clinton. It is not just her constant lying. It is not just that she throws off menacing glares and seethes thwarted entitlement. Watch closely. Something much darker rides along with it, a cold creepiness rarely seen. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Amen. Now, I know Craig. He's a good friend. As you know, he's likely to have to be in prison for the next 8 months because the Scottish courts bowed to the British, who bowed to the Americans, and want Craig Murray out of circulation. They want him as a sort of a mini object lesson to people who would challenge what's being done to his friend, our mutual friend, Julian. Now, after that little aside, what did you ask me again?
To elaborate on Julian's opinion of Hillary Clinton there.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, I watched her. I mean, I should, full disclosure would require my saying that at one point, when she was being idolized by particularly university students, and especially women, she came into the big auditorium at George Washington University in Washington. I had wangled a ticket to that panegyric for Hillary, and the subject of her talk was press freedom, how you really had to have freedom of expression, and in Iraq and Iran, they didn't have that. You know? Now, as she came in, everyone stood up and they applauded for what seemed like about 5 minutes. Then she started, and I said to myself, you know, somebody's got to make a statement here that she's not to be believed. So I took off my outer shirt. I had my Veterans for Peace shirt on. I stood up and I turned my back to her. Long story short, I was assaulted by 2 security people, put in an arm lock, bloodied, brought out behind the auditorium, all while Hillary Clinton didn't miss a syllable about how terrible it was, how the Iranians were not exercising or were not giving people freedom of speech. I mean, the irony was lost on everyone. Nobody came to my, everybody stood frozen. So anyhow, that's full disclosure. Now, that was before Libya. Now, even Obama and Bobby Gates say they were against Libya, for God's sake. And she persuaded, and this is important, she persuaded Medvedev, the Russian president at the time, that if he and the Chinese abstained on the UN resolution, that now this would just be a air cover sort of operation. There wouldn't be any real problems in Libya. She deceived them. And they have made that point several times. She lied, okay? And then when Gaddafi was killed, well, you probably remember this, the day he was killed, she was being interviewed, and the interviewer said, what do you think of Gaddafi? He had been impaled on a bayonet.
Yeah.
And cut up, and it was, the photos were there. And she looked at the interview and she said, she cackled. Well, we came.
We saw he died.
We saw he died.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, we're supposed to reserve judgment about calling people evil, and I will. But if this ain't the case, it's pretty close.
I mean, I personally find her quite unnerving, just for things like that. But I mean, like what Julian hit on with that tweet, she just strikes me as incredibly cold. I mean, she's also got this obsession with labeling everything to be a Russian asset. I mean, you've got Trump, Tulsi Gabbard, WikiLeaks, Jill Stein. It's such a Bernie Sanders. Yeah, I mean, it's such an obviously transparent McCarthyist tactic that I can't believe it actually sticks in the 21st century.
What's interesting here is that there is a Russian intelligence report dated July 26, 2016, which said Hillary Clinton is going to blame Russia on all this kind of thing. Russiagate started with Hillary Clinton giving the order to demean and despise Putin and the rest of us. And that was given on the 26th of July in the middle of the Democratic National Convention. I can prove that's the case. Her PR person later, months later, after the election said, we were told to go around on our motor scooters to the various cable and other networks to say that Putin was trying to defeat Hillary Clinton by helping Donald Trump. Now, this was a stretch for us to believe, says Jennifer Palmieri, the PR person for Hillary, but we tried to sell it, and nobody was really interested. But then, when we got back to Brooklyn, her headquarters, then various newspaper people working on national security and some intelligence officers, anonymous, they began to fill in the blanks. And then we could say, aha, so it was the Russians that hacked into the DNC. She said that in my presence. It's on tape. This is Jennifer Palmieri. Now, what also happened on the 26th of July, 2016? David Sanger, WMD famous or infamous David Sanger of the New York Times, had a piece which said exactly that the Russians had interfered with the election. This is early on now in July. And the whole thing that later the Russians report said she had authorized this whole thing. So she's the Queen of Hearts. She's the she's the person behind Russiagate. She says 17 intelligence agencies all agree that Putin ordered the hacking of the DNC, since disproven, okay? Oh, then they say months later, Clapper, head of national intelligence, well, it wasn't 17, it was really only 3. And actually it was just handpicked analysts from 3, NSA, CIA, FBI. And then later we learned from Kash Patel, who investigated this for the House Intelligence Committee, there wasn't really 3 agencies. It was just one. It was 4 or 5 analysts working for John Brennan. Now, you ask somebody in New York who reads the New York Times, I said, well, how many intelligence agencies were convinced that the Russians hacked the DNC emails? 17. Well, was it 17? No, it was 3. Was it 3? No, it was handpicked analysts from the 3. No, it wasn't 3. It was just one. It was John Brennan and 4 or 5 handpicked analysts. Give me a break. The people who read the major media have no concept that this is what happened. Now, the interesting thing is that the head of national intelligence had to reveal that Russian report. Why? Because it was leaked. How do I know it was leaked? I know it was leaked because a crimes report was issued. The president was informed, and the Justice Department had to decide whether to pursue this leak or whatever as a crime. That only happens when it's leaked. So somebody, in my view, and I can't prove this, but I know how the system works, okay? Somebody with a conscience said, too much. Hillary's manufacturing all this stuff. I'm going to slip this to the Russians. And it's not a state secret, for God's sake. They should know that Hillary's behind all this, okay? And so he or she did that. So why was there a crimes report? Because they wanted to find out who this person was, and because it was so explosive that they figured they had to tell the president as well. So if you know a little bit about how the system works, you can see how devious, how, what's the word? How irresponsible it is to take the major media version of all this without knowing how the system works.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, Hillary's loss is blamed on Russian interference. I mean, fast forward 4 years with the 2020 election. I mean, whether we're allowed to speak about it or not, who knows? But I mean, what's your perception of what actually happened there?
You mean Russian interference?
No, just in general. I mean, the whole everything got flipped. I mean, originally you had the Democrats crying out that it was Russian interference in the 2016 election. This time round in 2020, you had the Trump supporters claiming that it was rigged, obviously. So where do you stand on that?
Well, I would suggest that the male bovine excrement also applies to this situation. I have to see evidence. You know, I'm an evidence-based person. Sometimes there's not a lot of it, but you have to put together what you have. And there's no evidence adduced to suggest that the Russians messed in the 2020 election one way or another.
I wasn't suggesting the Russians. I just mean in general that something's wrong.
Well, you know, I'm no expert on election voting, but you know, the Russians have been blamed for interjecting in all manner of things, including the 2020 election. Well, my point is simply that there is no evidence of any of this, and if you go back to 2016, where we know that they didn't, and everybody else said they did, well, you really should look with a jaundiced eye on 4 years later. The more so since the head of NSA, the general who heads NSA, bragged right after the election saying, we took so many countermeasures that the Russians were unable to interfere in the 2020 election. So, you know, it's all male bovine excrement in my view. And it takes a lot of energy and a lot of publicity and a lot of air and print away from things that really do matter, like what's going to happen when China decides that the U.S. is sailing too close to Chinese waters, that the U.S. is challenging. U.S. we're trying to recognize Taiwan as a separate country. That's war, folks. That's war. And to be preoccupied with all this minutiae is a distraction, perhaps deliberate, on what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to try not to touch on China too much because I was hoping to speak to somebody about the China issue in particular for a full episode. So like we were saying about the Trump supporters there, I don't know whether you want to address this or not, but I mean, let's take QAnon, right, and how it became popular. I'll say this much about the Trump presidency. I mean, I think for me, the reason you get the Trump presidency in the first place is a pushback against the perceived establishment deep state group embodied by the likes of Hillary Clinton, and a built-in resentment probably surrounding the financial crash and the promises Obama made that weren't delivered, for example, and the way all those events played out over however many years. I mean, the QAnon material as well, it's quite heavily linked to Jeffrey Epstein, which seems to be a bit of a bottomless pit of compromise, abuse, corruption. I mean, can you try and tie all of that together for us and explain how you saw all that play out?
I guess I can. I know very little about QAnon. My general impression about why Trump won was that there were legitimate grievances unaddressed by people who lost their jobs, people whose standard of living had gone way, way down, people who had felt ignored. Yeah. And despite all of Trump's obvious flaws, were so much against the system that had made their lives miserable. And there were enough of them that they rose up, voted pretty much to have new people come in, no matter how terrible they were, in my view. I should go on record as saying I think Donald Trump was the worst president the United States ever had, and that's saying something, okay? So there was this backlash, and it was not helped by Hillary not deigning to appear in some of the battleground states, for God's sake, you know? And then did the WikiLeaks disclosures, not from a Russian hack, but from a DNC insider, did they hurt Hillary? I imagine they did. Do you blame the Russians for that? No. Who do you blame for that? If blame is the right word, you blame the person who stuck his or her thumb drive into the DNC computer and got that to WikiLeaks. What did those emails show? They showed that Hillary had stolen the nomination from Bernie Sanders, pure and simple. The next day, the top 5 people of the DNC resigned. What does that tell you? Okay. So all I'm saying here is that was the truth. People knew that this was in black and white. Julian Assange doesn't fool around with this stuff. He gets it and he publishes it after he puts it in some kind of searchable order. And they could see all these Bernie Sanders. Can you imagine working your rear end off for Bernie Sanders for months and months, maybe even years, and then seeing how Hillary had manipulated the system, how she had, really stacked the deck against Bernie, how you would feel? Well, I would have trouble voting for Hillary, I tell you, as a Democrat, if I were a Bernie Sanders person. So what am I saying? I'm saying that could have hurt him. That could have hurt her, but it's her own damn fault. What those emails revealed was the truth. So, there are complex factors involved here. Those are my best guesses. I'm no expert on internal political matters in the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Well, regarding his foreign policy, then, Trump's in particular, how do you think he dealt with Iran, North Korea, and Russia? Because from where I'm sitting, the media just flat out refused to give him any wins. It was either he was soft or a Russian asset, or he was cozying up to dictators when it was North Korea. I mean, I heard you say something on a different show where you said, it's not, why is it considered to be a crazy idea to actually want to be friends with Russia? It's obviously seems like a much better plan than let's toy with World War III.
Well, exactly. They wanted to blacken Trump. And you referred to the Mickey Mat. And let me just say a word about that. It's a term heartily endorsed by Stephen Cohen, the late Stephen Cohen, dean of serious Russian historians, and by Pepe Escobar. So you got all sides of the spectrum here. It's, if you got a pencil, take it out. The military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, Eisenhower, of course, talked about the MIC, the military industrial complex. And he said that the danger is great, that the accretion of power here, either intended or not intended, is a menace to our democracy. He knew whereof he spoke, okay? Now, what is it now? It's much bigger now. Now you have the deep state embodied in it, intelligence, and media. Who pays the media? The rest of the deep state, the rest of the Mickey Mat. So remember, it rhymes with Mickey Mouse. That's how you can remember it. It's the Mickey Mat, and they control this kind of stuff. Do they control the president? Well, the president can't do much unless the Mickey Mat approves of it. Now, what does the Mickey Mat need to profiteer, to make more and more weapons and sell more and more weapons? They need an enemy. Got to have a palpable, tangible, credible enemy. Who better than Russia? And now China is, coming into the fore. Okay, so it isn't rocket science. I mean, what I like to cite, Pope Francis, I don't agree with a lot of what he says, but he did hit it on the nail on the head when he came to Congress, and he said, the main problem in the world is the blood-drenched arms traders. Blood-drenched arms traders. And the congressmen and senators all got up and said, oh, yeah, oh, right, sure, you got it. And then they looked in their pocket for the latest envelope from Lockheed, the one from Raytheon here, who was giving hypocrisy a bad name, But that's the key to it. People profiteer on tension. And if you want a credible enemy, Russia is elected. And if you can stoke tension, as we have done in Central Europe, if you can renege on promises, as we have in advancing NATO to Russia's border, if you can overthrow a duly elected pro-Russian government in Kiev, well, you just do it. And then, then you make up stories about how Putin invaded. Serious people keep saying Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, he didn't invade Ukraine. Whoa, that's news. Please, listeners, stay with me, okay? The Russians were entitled to 20 to 30,000 troops in Sevastopol, their only all-season naval base in Crimea. And it was those folks that they sent out to the various ministries, the Ukrainian ministries, and they had no insignia on, but everyone knew they were Russian troops. And they said, oh, look, now we have instructions from Moscow. We're supposed to take over this ministry. You probably don't have any instructions from the coup regime in Kiev. So could you please just step aside? We don't want any trouble. And they stepped aside. How many people were killed? None. Not one. So it was a peaceful, pretty artful, if I may say so, takeover of Crimea. How about the Donbass? How about Luhansk and Donetsk? Well, those people didn't want any part of living under these neo-Nazis that came in. And I use that term advisedly, okay? Neither did the Russians want to see their own people, many of them Russian citizens, millions of them Russian citizens in the Donbass being taken over by these folks in Kiev, the folks that we installed in Kiev. So what did the Russians do? Did they invade? No, they didn't invade. Did they help? Of course they helped. Did they send volunteers, as we often do, in to help the indigenous forces? Of course they did. But this whole business about a Russian invasion, the Donbass is in many senses Russian ethnic superior. I mean, the majority of people are Russian ethnics. As I said, Putin allowed them to have Russian citizenship, so there are millions that have Russian citizenship. And Putin has made a very, very strong point of the fact that when the Soviet Union fell apart, he said it was a tragic day. In what sense? He was very specific. It wasn't that the USSR fell apart. It was that millions and millions of Russian citizens all of a sudden found themselves in other countries, for God's sake. Other countries, like Ukraine. And he made that point several times very poignantly. And so these Russian citizens in the Donbass are going to be helped by the Russians. And this is where it all came to a head. The Russians said, you're not going to move those troops across that line. Otherwise, we have 80,000, we have 100,000. We have 2 armies and 3 airborne formations, and we're going to use them. And finally, Washington got Ukrainian President Zelensky to back off. Look, Zelensky, you're not going to take Crimea back as you have ordered in an edict, and you're not going to go invade the Donbass. We won't support you. And that's how it all kind of simmered down. And that was when somebody said, President Biden, this is really serious. It almost came to an ignominious back down by us because we're not going to take the Russians on there. And it would look really bad. So maybe we ought to, why don't you propose a summit and let's be able to tell the Russians, we're not going to fool around there anymore. We're not going to let Zelensky make these preposterous claims. We're not going to let the Ukrainians try to take over the Donbass. And then, maybe we'll all feel a little bit more comfortable. I'd add one thing from my experience, and this is purely speculative as opposed to what I've been saying, okay? It's within the realm of possibility that things were so tense in Ukraine that I would think that Putin may have notched up their readiness posture, strategic readiness posture a notch. In other words, so that the U.S. could say, whoa, this is really serious. They've gone to an increased readiness strategic posture. Now, I don't know that happened, but I would not rule it out. And all the more so, these wet behind the ears guys like Jake Sullivan would have said, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, let's get a summit and we can talk about this. And that, if you recall, was exactly when Biden proposed the summit. It was on the same day, April 13th, to be precise. What happened was Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary General of NATO, said, oh my God, the Russians are massing troops on the Ukrainian border in unprecedented numbers. Next thing, Shoigu, Russian defense minister, says, you got that right, Stoltenberg. Would you believe 2 armies and 3 airborne formations? That's what we got there. Next thing you know, same day, Ryabkov, deputy foreign minister, says, look, you guys want to send 2 guided missile destroyers into the Black Sea? Forget about it. Forget about it. Because we cannot guarantee their safety. What happens? Biden tells them to go to Greece instead. Okay. And last but not least, Biden says, he calls Putin and says, look, we need to tamp things down. How about a summit? Let's have a summit. Now, that's how it started, okay? And that, I think, was a salutary thing. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous given the circumstances of tension, but it worked out okay. At least they know each other now, and there was a lot that wasn't done, but some things were done. So we can look at the glass half full again, rather than half empty.
Yeah, I watched parts of that summit. Putin certainly looked a bit bored listening to Biden at times, I'll say that much. But he also, at one of the press conferences, Biden came out with a straight face. He said, how would it be if the United States were viewed by the rest of the world as interfering with the elections directly of other countries and everybody knew it? What would it be like if we engaged in activities that he, Putin, engaged in? It diminishes the standing of a country. I mean, surely Biden knows better than to make that statement. I mean, anyone with a basic grasp of the history of geopolitics knows that's exactly what the US has done, certainly in places like South America, for example. So how can he say it with a straight face, basically?
Well, that's alarming. I mean, this is not funny. He did say it with a straight face. He may have said it to Vladimir Putin with a straight face. And Putin, of course, knows chapter and verse about how the U.S., the Harvard boys, and the economic oligarchs from the United States intervened in Russian politics in the 90s, and how they contributed to the economic disarray. I would say plundering is the right word, plundering of the Russian economy. He would know that in 1996, Yeltsin, that drunkard, was on his way out. The polls indicated he was bound to lose that election. And guess what happened? The Harvard boys came in, IMF loan was given, all kinds of election help was made, and he won. And Time magazine recorded his win with a picture of Yeltsin on the top and the headline saying, U.S. wins the election for Yeltsin. 4 more years of that drunkard.
Yeah.
Now, people don't know that between, I think it's 1991 and 1996, the mortality rate for Russian males went down by 6 years. 6 years, okay? People were starving to death. Russians remember that. They know about starving.
Yeah.
Yeah. They know 1 million people starved to death in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, when then the Nazis besieged that city. And just by the way, Putin's big brother was one of those who did not survive that siege. So, Putin knows all this stuff. So what's my point here? Now, let's say Biden did say that kind of thing to Putin. My God, that's not good. That shows somebody who's not really with it. Worse still, when Biden talked about what else he told Putin, he said, well, you know, I don't want to quote him because that wouldn't be appropriate, but I reminded him of that multi-thousand-mile border with China. Plainside, later in the day, he said, you know, the Russians are in a very, very, very tight spot. China is squeezing them. China is squeezing them. My God. Does Biden not know that it's not 50 years ago when China was squeezing Russia and they were having firefights across the riverine border? Does he not know that the relationship between Russia and China now is so close that we can talk about a virtual military alliance? Here's one last thing. The Chinese newspaper that is printed in English and really reflects Chinese leaders' views said 2 days ago, look, you know, if Biden of the United States tries to take advantage of either Russia or China, we will together retaliate. Whoa, I've been saying that for months, that's likely what one should expect, but I've never seen any Chinese ruler-influenced newspaper claim that. I've looked hard at the Russian reaction. The Russians have not repeated that, but you know, that's the reality. You don't want to advertise that because that does sort of bind you. Let's say the U.S. does something stupid in the Taiwan Straits and there is a war. I'd like, if I were Putin, I'd like to be a little bit free to choose what to do in support of my Chinese ally or what not to do.
Yeah, I thought Putin was quite interesting on the. Have you seen the Oliver Stone documentary? Yeah, that was. He came across quite well on that. But I mean, how do you? What do you think about him essentially rewriting the constitutional rules to maintain power for longer? I mean, I've kind of rationalized it as Russia had a traumatic 20th century experience. And going into the 21st century, you've got forces that are acting in the Western government that Russia doesn't necessarily have the time and inclination to address because they're still playing catch up from communism. But it seems to be going quite well, you know, like improvements in terms of GDP. So Putin surely believes he's the person to improve Russian lives and justifies to himself the tampering with constitutional issues, possibly. I mean, is that a fair assessment of why he's still in power?
Well, that's a really good question. Let me first add a little codicil to what Oliver Stone has told me about his encounters with Putin. I know Oliver, and I admire him greatly. He told me that after one of the sessions, Putin turned to him and said, you know, we Russians are feeling like Jews in the 1930s. Feeling like Jews in the 1930s. Huh. Think about that. Blamed for everything, ostracized, demeaned, killed. Oliver thought that to be a very poignant little anecdote. He shared it with me, and I have permission from him to share that with anybody. So that's number one. Now, with respect to Putin's longevity in office, well, ipso facto, I think it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing to be in power for 20 years or whatever. Okay. There are exceptions. Now, Putin may be one of those exceptions. As you point out, he's got a lot of repair work to do. He's doing it under great duress, under great challenge from everybody except China. China's sort of helping, okay? So you can carve out a rationalization to say, well, you know, it's not a done deal. He may relent and not run this again. But if he does, well, what's the alternative? Ideally, the alternative would be that Russian politics would have matured to the point where somebody suitable would be able to come into power, somebody as bright as Putin and as forceful, and things would go along at a regular clip. But who can be sure of that? I mean, one of the clownish things is when the National Endowment for Democracy and other U.S. organs want to depose, want to get rid of Putin, well, who are they going to replace him with? Could be worse. It could be somebody very much worse for the U.S. for anybody else. So I'm of two minds on that. I think, ipso facto, it's not a good idea, but there are special circumstances here. Putin has not had a real long time to put things back in order. After the 90s, when everything fell apart, it is 2021. One can argue, well, if you can't get a suitable replacement really in gear by now, what's going to happen when you finally do leave, So I'm, as you can see, mixed emotions on this. I think, and I'll go on record as saying this, that Putin has been a restraining and a very adroit statesman. And when people say, he's a terrible guy or he's evil, or I spent some time in Germany. I was posted there for 5 years. And when the last time I was there were these little buttons and it shows a portrait of Putin and it says, Putin verstehe. Now, verstehen means understanding, right? So Putin verstehe, somebody who understands Putin. Now, I would think on the face of it, that would be a good thing, right? So, I would characterize myself as by virtue of a half century of following Russian leaders, that I am a Putin versteher. But you know what? That's a pejorative. In Germany, that's a terrible thing to call anybody that you happen to agree with or at least understand. Putin, okay? So that's how bad it's gotten. So, if Putin's going to be around a little while longer, I would say that's a lucky thing for us, because maybe by and by, step by step, educated people realize that it's better to be a Putin versteher than a Putin denigrator, than a Putin blackener, as if he were the devil.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment. In the last 18 months, I think a lot more people have become open to alternative media. It's fast becoming like a new lifestyle choice for people to reject mainstream narratives. I mean, the work that you've done, WikiLeaks, Snowden, Assange, etc., it does mean the world to a lot of people, especially those of us that essentially feel helpless in the face of things like the endless wars and governments seemingly not working to improve people's lives. So I'd just like to thank you for being somebody very credible who can talk about all these things, and certainly thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, you're most welcome. And this is good news. Some of us feel, and myself included, that we sort of send our articles and our interviews into the ether and nobody reads them or nobody listens. So I am encouraged that at least we have a following on your podcast, and perhaps we'll meet again.
Yes, that would be lovely. Thank you very much, Ray.
Most welcome, Matthew.
Join us next time for the Political Dark Side Podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.